So by the way, little side note, like nobody say anything. I actually live right next door to Joe Brady's parents. Joe Brady and I
Ooh.
are the same age. We've grown up next to each other our whole lives. We follow each other on Twitter. It's so adorable that whenever I see his mom out in the front, they walk their dogs and, they're just there talking. She follows me on Instagram and she's like, I see what you're doing with fantasy football. That's so great. She's like, tell all of your followers, they got to get that Kincaid kit. They got to get him. Joe loves him. I'm like, okay, thank you.
All
Thanks for
right.
the tip. And so that was not the driving factor in this because she told me that months and months and months ago, even like when he was a
You should have
rookie.
let off with that.
I should have.
Knowledge is
That's the
invaluable.
cold open. That's what
Yeah.
gets you in here, folks. Let's start with the players that you're looking to buy in Dynasty. This could be anyone. I don't even know who it is. Maybe it's a young guy, old guy like yourself. Let's see who you're talking about.
Well, this goes back to what we were talking about when I try to look at the market and how the market is valuing players and players that I believe in. And right now, for me, this probably doesn't come as a surprise to people that have listened to this show. I am trying to buy Rashee Rice. And a lot of people see
Okay.
Marquise Brown and his addition in Kansas City and say, well, Marquise Brown has been a 25% target share type of player every single year. That's going to negatively impact Rashee Rice. And I do understand the logic. I do. There is a world where Marquise Brown comes in and becomes the immediate wide receiver one, and Rashee Rice falls by the wayside. But I don't see that happening. And again, this is something I've talked about on this show. So you might hear me kind of reuse some terminology that I've used in the past, but I dug a little bit deeper yesterday, and they just operate in such different parts of the field. Marquise Brown can do a lot more. He's not simply a deep threat. We're not talking about a Gabe Davis type of player here. He can run every route on the route tree, but he is primarily used deeper downfield. On the opposite side of the coin, Rashee Rice is typically used close to the line of scrimmage. And if you look, Brown's ADOT has never been below 11 yards in a single season. Actually, if you look over his last 2 years in Arizona, he only had 3 games where he was above 7.6. Now, why is 7.6 yards of average depth meaningful? Because Rashee Rice has never eclipsed more than 7.6 average yards of depth in a single game on his targets. And last year, he was at just 4.8. So, again, a lot of numbers here that I'm spitting out at you, and I might have lost you, but Marquise Brown plays deep down the field. Rashee Rice plays near the line of scrimmage. So these guys are going to complement each other very well. I don't see this as a cannibalization type of scenario where they hurt each other. I think, if anything, this elevates the entire offense. Marquise Brown is in a great spot. Rashee Rice is in a great spot. Patrick Mahomes is going to be the biggest beneficiary here. And if anything, I think Travis Kelce, who showed his age a little bit last year, is the guy we need to be worried about. So right now, if you're looking at value and where Rashee Rice compares to some other guys, if I could move down from any of the other 2023 rookies besides Puka, I'm talking JSN, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, these guys. If I can move down and add a pick to Rashee Rice and make that sort of trade, I'm doing that in a heartbeat. I'd flip Saquon, Eckler, Travis Etienne, a lot of these kind of back end RB1s for Rashee Rice. What we saw last year is that from the second half of the season through the playoffs, he pulled a 27.3% target share. That was 11th best in the NFL. This guy pulls targets, he makes catches, he makes plays after the catch, and he is tied to the best quarterback in football. So I'm buying Rashee Rice right now.
Go off, Dave. That was nice. That was nice. I can listen. I'm picking up what you're putting down, man. Like I think that at first when I saw you put Rashee Rice as the guy that you wanted to buy, I was like, but everyone wants him. Like he was a young rookie with Patrick Mahomes and probably be the wide receiver one. And then I used our trusty friend Keep Trade Cut, which,
Mhm.
whatever your opinions on it may be, it's just a crowdsourcing tool and it says how other people value these players. And to see him right now being valued as the wide receiver 24 and be on a downward trend because of Marquise Brown, like, yeah, that's probably the window. I'm still intrigued to see what happens. Like, what happens with Marquise Brown and Rashee Rice, because I know you mentioned Rashee Rice is the close to the line of scrimmage guy. Marquise Brown is the downfield guy. We've seen them be used in various roles, at least throughout their tenure in the NFL. Rashee Rice, like I keep going back to this. What made Rashee Rice such a weird and complicated prospect for me was that he was the go and get it jump ball 50-50 guy downfield. And then all of a sudden he gets the NFL and it's a totally different player. I'm curious
We
to
see
see
that a
how that
lot. We saw
goes.
that with Zay Flowers too. Like Zay Flowers in college, like he
Yeah,
was just a burner getting deep
doing the
downfield, and
opposite.
all of a
Yep.
sudden he gets into the NFL and they're just manufacturing jet sweeps and screens and slants for him. We see that a lot with younger players.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that just kind of is just get the ball in the hands of good players. Like that's it. I think the new generation of NFL coaches are not trying to make things as complicated anymore. They know that their quarterbacks probably don't have as much time, especially if they're not super mobile guys, because defenses are getting more athletic. So let's just get the ball to the really fast guys, the really athletic guys, the playmakers as quick as we can. And I think you're right. I think regardless of what the roles end up being, there's probably not going to be this cannibalization that people think, which, by the way, never thought I'd be using cannibalization in today's episode, but there we go.
3 times.
3 times. Cannibalization, 4. All right. Now, you know what? You talk about Rashee Rice. You talk about his quarterback, Patrick Mahomes. Jagger May and I did a really interesting scouting report video where we did a whole prospect profile on the guy who could be seen as the next Patrick Mahomes, Caleb Williams. And go check that out on our YouTube. It was a lot of fun to do. We break down the film. We take a look at the metrics. We take a look at, for all of you numbers bros, the analytics bros, what makes Caleb Williams special. And then we talk about where he's going in dynasty drafts. Obviously, quarterback 101 for super flex, but where you can value him amongst the rest of the crop of quarterbacks in dynasty. So go check that out on our YouTube, youtube.com/football guys. Now I'm going to give you my player that I am buying. And Dave, it kind of goes back to like what our philosophy is on buying players. And yes, I'm a kind of a go against the grain guy as well. But I think with Dynasty, I tend to take a safer approach than I do in redraft. Redraft, I feel like if you mess something up, you can go to the waiver wire and you can find a Kyron Williams. You can find a Puka Nacua. You can get a Raheem Mostert. You can get these guys who are just actually going to be available. Whereas in Dynasty, the waiver wire is so much thinner. So when I look at these players I want to buy a guy who I think still has a good ceiling, but is not going to potentially set back my team years and years and years because of the draft capital I have to give up. So yeah, I mean, you could always say like, go and get a Puka Nacua, something like that. That's going to cost you a ton of picks, right? The guy I'm looking at here is going to be T. Higgins, and he's being valued as the wide receiver 21. And I think that what we see when it comes to dynasty football, fantasy football, whatever it is, in ADP and value, is that there's always value to be had in uncertainty in a player's circumstances, wherever they're at. If we don't know what team they're going to be on, right now, T. Higgins has this trade request with the Cincinnati Bengals. And listen, sometimes it doesn't turn into anything, but we've seen a couple of other franchise players get traded. I think the important thing to remember with all of this is that T. Higgins is a very good player. I think we have such a short memory where we're only thinking of what happened this past year, an off year for the Bengals, where Joe Burrow was injured, T. Higgins was injured. The Bengals were awful in the first 4 weeks. They had 2 passing touchdowns over the first 4 games. Joe Burrow and T. Higgins only played 7 games together last year. You got to take last year and just make that a wash. Throw that out the window here. And go back and look. In 2021, he's the wide receiver 14. In 2022, he's the wide receiver 17. Right now, he's being valued as the wide receiver 21 because we've got some good young prospects. We've got some good players going into their second year, and that sort of pushes him down. And this unrest about where he's going to be is going to keep pushing him down the board. That's fine. But if I'm a competing team this year, and I think I can, get over that hump with another good player on my roster, and I'm looking at maybe having the pick 108, maybe even 107, or excuse me, 108 in a super flex. So let's say 107 in a single quarterback league. I'll trade those for T. Higgins all day. And according to Keep Trade Cut, like that is a trade that is happening.
Mhm.
So much so, like I'll even talk about my dynasty league that I'm in. I'm in a startup draft right now with Danny Kelly from The Ringer, who's going to be our guest next week. And is a trade I did with him. A 2025 first round pick and a 2025 third round pick for T. Higgins. And T. Higgins is essentially going to be my wide receiver 3 on this team, with Amon St. Brown, Tank Dell, T. Higgins, Deontay Johnson, and Jahan Dotson. That's, I mean, to get rid of one of those picks is perfectly fine. That's a perfectly fine price to make sure you have a stacked wide receiver room in Dynasty. And we've seen, even if he does get traded, these wide receivers that get traded, they do just fine. They do just fine in fantasy. Some of them even get a lot
AJ
better and they
Brown,
flourish. Yes. Yeah.
DJ Moore, exactly.
And that's been like the topic that we talk about all the time, right? But we've also seen that typically, just like we saw this year, good wide receivers don't hit free agency. So if T. Higgins ends up anywhere else, it's going to be a trade. And a team gives up a lot of capital or is willing to pay, because that's the other thing now, is that they not only have to give up capital, but they have to pay T. Higgins. They're going to use him. So even in a worst case scenario, sure, you get T. Higgins gets Terry McLaurin, and his fantasy value gets a little bit nerfed, and you're looking at a low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3. But that's pretty close to the value that you're getting right here. And you didn't break the bank. You didn't ruin your dynasty team and set them back for years and years and years. You're kind of already paying for that. So, I'm fine with it. And I think that even if he stays in Cincinnati and continues to ball out, like, cool. You've got a guy that has upside, minimal cost right now. And I still think he's got this potential to be a top 15, maybe even as high as top 12 wide receiver. And you're paying low end wide receiver 2 value to get there, Dave.
Yeah, and recency bias is another thing to capitalize on in dynasty trades. And T. Higgins is coming off a down year where he was
Yep.
injured, and then when he was finally back in and healthy, then Joe Burrow was injured, and
7 games
with Jake
together. That's
Browning.
it.
Exactly, yeah, and T. Higgins is just a talented player. I don't know if he's what is he still just 26 years old? So he's still like in the
25. He's still
25, yeah.
25.
Yeah, still in the prime of his career. Yeah, he's a guy that you're just betting on the talent, whether it's with Cincinnati or with another team. He's going to be fine. T. Higgins is a great guy to go out and buy right now. You're not going to get any pushback from me on T. Higgins.
Now, the one argument that I keep hearing is like, what if he goes to a really bad team? What if he ends up on the Carolina Panthers as another wide receiver with Deontay Johnson?
Wouldn't be
One,
crazy
I don't
about that, but
I
he'll still be
wouldn't
fine.
be too excited. Right. Like I don't I also don't know if the Panthers really have that kind of capital to go out and give up for T. Higgins. I mean, maybe they give up
Yeah,
their
don't
second
have a
round
first
pick.
round pick. Yeah,
Yeah. Maybe they give up their second round pick and then they pay him. But if you're gonna do that, it means you're probably gonna use the guy.
mhm,
The other one I've heard is what if he goes to the Patriots, right? And he's with Drake May. Okay. Yeah, it's probably not good for the rookie year,
yeah.
but all signs indicate that he's going to be the target guy. Like we see this all the time, whether it's rookie quarterback, high targets, like these players can still be
Yeah, do you
valuable,
remember when
excuse me.
AJ Brown was completely nerfed because he was going to Philadelphia and the Eagles didn't pass and Jalen Hurts wasn't good? Guess what? AJ Brown had a career year his first year there. Same thing with DJ Moore last year. We heard
Yep.
Justin
That
Fields
that was the
doesn't
next
throw.
one.
All of these teams, and I did a study on this last year, where when Arizona traded for DeAndre Hopkins, when the Dallas Cowboys traded for Amari Cooper, when the Bears traded for DJ Moore, like all of these big trades that we've seen for number one wide receivers, every single one of those teams significantly ups their pass rate going into the following year. So if a team does go out and trade for T. Higgins, they're not trading for T. Higgins so they could play him in line and use him as a sixth blocker. They're trading for T. Higgins
Right.
because they want to feature him as a wide receiver one, and we'll see them game plan around a guy like him.
Yeah. 100% agree. I think we've hit the nail on the head with T. Higgins. Go out and send out your offers, guys. Dave, why don't you hit us with your next player that you want to buy in Dynasty?
All right. Again, we'll talk about some recency bias here. Tank Dell was on a heater in the middle of the
Mm,
season, and I
mm.
think a lot of people saw Nico Collins close out the year. Nico Collins have his huge playoff game, and because of that, I think there's an opportunity to buy Tank Dell. If you look in the 4 games before his injury last year, he averaged 10.8 targets, 92.3 yards, and more than one touchdown per game. He had 5 touchdowns in 4 games. Only Keenan Allen and CeeDee Lamb were outscoring him in fantasy points over that 4 game stretch. And over that stretch, he was outpacing Nico Collins in targets, yards, receptions, touchdowns, routes, air yards, like you name it. He was the wide receiver one in that offense. Again, much like Rashee Rice, Tank Dell is tied to a young and ascending, very good quarterback. And I just want to buy into this Houston Texans offense. So right now, Tank Dell is a wide receiver 20 on keep trade cut. He's behind Nico Collins despite being a bit younger and despite outperforming him before his injury. So when I look at a guy like Nico Collins, I'm not just going out and selling the farm to bring him in, but if you can look at some of the wide receivers that are ahead of him, Nico Collins, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, if I can trade down and get Tank Dell and then add, a second round pick on top of that, those are the moves I'm trying to make where I can get a guy who I see as a pretty similar value that I can get for a little bit cheaper. As far as running backs go, we'll get into running backs a little bit later. I don't like these middling to back end RB1s. I think they're always a little bit overvalued. Right now, I would take Dell over any running back besides Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, Brees Hall, and Christian McCaffrey. If I can flip any running back on my roster and get Tank Dell, I'm doing that because we're looking at a guy
Ooh.
who's still just 24 years old, who's going to be with the Houston Texans and CJ Stroud for at least the next 3 years. We're looking at a pretty safe asset here going forward. Reports are coming off of this injury that he suffered that ended his season, that he looks, I don't know if you saw this one, Alfredo, 10 times faster than he was last year. Everybody says that
It
he has
is
lost a
it is
step.
humanly possible to get 10 times faster after an injury. Yes, I have read this in various medical journals.
So also, if you're in your rookie drafts right now and you've got the 107 or later, I'd move any of those picks for Tank Dell. So obviously, I don't want to give up the big three wide receivers or the big three quarterbacks, but I'm kind of at that where if you can give up Brock Bowers or the wide receiver four, whoever you've got there, and flip that for Tank Dell, I'm doing that.
Yeah, I don't and that's interesting because I don't know that the Tank Dell manager is doing that, but maybe they get a little worried. You mentioned those running backs, and you mentioned a few names that you wouldn't trade for Tank Dell, but there's some other value adjacent players at the running back position that are sexy names, and I'm curious to see where you fall in this. So, Kyron Williams or Tank Dell?
Give me Tank Dell in a heartbeat. I didn't want to make Kyron Williams
Wow.
sell on this show, but yeah, Kyron Williams, that's the exact guy that I'm trying to get off my roster right now. A guy who has a lot of red flags as a prospect that is coming off of a great season. It's not to say that Kyron Williams can't be great, but signs tells that he's probably going to regress within the next year or so. So yeah, but I mean, I'm not kidding. When I said any running back not named Jahmyr Gibbs, Brees Hall, Bijan Robinson, or CMC, I mean it. I'd flip any other running back for Tank Dell.
Okay, so just I want to put names to those. I want to put names to those. Devon Achan, yes or no?
Yep. Devon Achan is
Okay,
another guy that I'm trying to
so
sell
you would
right now.
trade him.
Yep.
You would Jonathan Taylor or Tank Dell.
That one's close for me. And I think that in that position, I mean, I would do it in a vacuum. But the nice thing is, if you're making a trade for a guy like Jonathan Taylor, you could probably get extra capital on top of it. So you give up Jonathan Taylor, and in return, you can get Tank Dell plus a lesser running back. Throw in a Zamir White or one of these injury away guys, throw one of those guys in, throw a second round pick in. That's the type of deal I'm trying to make. But in a vacuum, I do prefer Tank Dell to Jonathan Taylor.
All right, I'm with it. I'm with it. I think that's the right way to go. You very rarely find these super talented receivers that you can get at a bit of a discount that are attached to very good quarterbacks and should be for a long time. Remember, this was the guy that CJ Stroud was like, "Go and draft me him."
Mhm.
He told the Texans, "Draft Tank Dell for me," and then he
To be
used
fair,
him.
we used that narrative for Clyde Edwards-Helaire for a few years with Patrick Mahomes too.
Did he
I
really? Did he say that? Okay, just don't
it was
trust
it was
Patrick
after
Mahomes
his
then.
first Super Bowl win, they, like, gave him, like, "Pick whoever you want with the first round pick," and he went out and
What an
picked CJ.
idiot.
Yeah.
Patrick
Sometimes
Mahomes, what are you doing?
sometimes players aren't the best
He
evaluators of
sat there
talent.
and looked at Jonathan Taylor and was like, "Nah,
Yeah. I'm much
give
more
me
excited
pot
about
roast over
what
there."
Tank Dell did in his rookie season than CJ Stroud wanting him.
Uh yeah, Tank Dell. Go by. All right, next one on here. I'm going with a player that I think is sort of under the radar right now at a position that has such an incredible premium that when you have a good player at this position, your team is good and not just good, like they're good for a long time. And I'm talking about Dalton Kincaid, the tight end for the Buffalo Bills. And there's some interesting things going on at the tight end position, Dave. One, I look at where he is on keep trade cut, which is just the outsourcing value of people who play dynasty. Tight end 6 behind TJ Hawkinson and Brock Bowers. That value could change by the time someone's watching or listening to this, but that's where it's at right now.
Bowers ahead of Kincaid is silly.
Well, Bowers was up at like tight end 2 or
I
3 not
remember.
too long
I
ago, and that's
remember.
been
Yeah.
slowly going down. And it may go down where he's below Kincaid. Hawkinson still up higher. Interesting as well. I think I'd probably have Kincaid as the tight end 4, maybe even tight end 3, depending on how you feel about Kyle Pitts. I genuinely believe, and I think you do too, that the tight end 1 position for Dynasty is still kind of up for grabs. I think a lot of people have made this argument that it is Sam Laporta, no questions asked. And then you've got a few people like us who have said, guys, it might be Trey McBride because of the volume that he's getting there, because of the level of quarterback play that he's getting. Uh, you know, whatever you want to make the excuse for. Now Kyle Pitts is creeping up. I think there's an opening here where you can go and buy Dalton Kincaid at tight end 6 value, and there's a chance that he provides you back with tight end 1 production. How likely is that? I'm not going to say it's extremely likely, but if it's a possibility, we've got to take that chance in a trade here because even if you're wrong, he's probably still a top 6 tight end. So there's not much that you're missing out on here. I want to take a look at this, Dave. I tweeted this out earlier. For the final 11 weeks of the season, and this is not a shot against Sam Laporta. So Sam Laporta stands and Detroit Lions fans, like, please don't crush me in the comments. This is not a thing against him. Sam Laporta's fantastic. He's phenomenal. We're just simply looking at production here. For the final 11 weeks of the season, the averages for these two players, Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid, nearly identical on targets. 7 targets for Laporta, 6.5 for Kincaid per game. 5 receptions per game for each of them. 51 yards per game for each of them. Nearly identical in every single metric except the touchdown variation, where Sam Laporta had 7 touchdowns over the final 11 weeks and Dalton Kincaid had just 2. Now, touchdowns are a really tough thing to predict. They're not often that sticky. What I do like seeing is that Dalton Kincaid actually had a higher first read target share over Sam Laporta, 20% versus
Can I ask you real
19%.
real quickly? I don't mean to cut you off,
Yeah,
Alfredo. What week did you start this split at? Just curious.
7, week 7,
All right. So,
because that's when Dalton Kincaid was actually like getting out there on the field.
all right, because I just wanted, it was week 11 is when Ken Dorsey was fired, and what I noticed from watching the games is that Joe Brady, the new offensive
Yeah.
coordinator, really liked him some Dalton Kincaid and
Yes.
started drawing up a lot more plays where Dalton
Uh,
Kincaid was the first read. And I don't know if I
can I
just stole your thunder a little bit. Keep going.
No, no, and well, that's exactly what I was saying here, where
Yeah.
it's 20% first read target share over the 19 for Sam Laporta.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, little side note, like nobody say anything. I actually live right next door to Joe Brady's parents. Joe Brady and I
Ooh.
are the same age. We've grown up next to each other our whole lives. We follow each other on Twitter. It's so adorable that whenever I see his mom out in the front, they walk their dogs and, they're just there talking. She follows me on Instagram and she's like, I see what you're doing with fantasy football. That's so great. She's like, tell all of your followers they got to get that Kincaid kid. They got to get him. Joe loves him. I'm like, okay, thank you.
All
Thanks for
right.
the tip. And so that was not the driving factor in this because she told me that months and months and months ago, even like when he was a
You should have
rookie.
let off with that.
I
That kind
should
of
have. I
insider
should have.
knowledge
That's
is
that's the
invaluable.
cold open. That's what
Yeah.
gets you in here, folks. But listen. What we see from Dalton Kincaid is one, he's a talented player. He's getting the targets. Even the numbers are matching the film, right? For all the people that really loved him. There's so many other data points that say Kincaid is just as good as the other top tight ends, whether it's targets per route run, first downs per route run, which is a really fun metric that I've been looking at. Props to Ryan Heath over at Fantasy Points. And fantasy points per route run. Like there's so many of these little metrics that just work in favor of Dalton Kincaid and say he's just as good as the other top guys. And if we're worried about the touchdown variance, and that's what it was the 5 touchdowns that really split them from like, hey, you're dynasty
Mhm.
tight end 6 versus dynasty tight end 1. I'm willing to bet on Josh Allen, on the Buffalo Bills, on the fact that they can score points and say, hey, that variance can easily swing in the other direction. And we're looking at a guy that can consistently be a top 3 tight end every single year. The one thing that I've heard is the negative, right? Is that, oh, maybe Dalton Kincaid has a Dawson Knox problem. Guys, Dawson Knox is not
Mhm.
being used enough. He's not being targeted enough. The route participation is not enough. And even seeing how Dalton Kincaid was moved around from the slot to inline to out wide, which, by the way, out wide might happen more often this year now that Curtis Samuel's on the team. Uh, you wouldn't look at Mark Andrews and say Mark Andrews has an Isaiah Likely problem. No, you're saying Mark Andrews is going to go and get his targets. Now, it's apples and oranges a little bit, but those apples and oranges are kind of similar still. Dalton Kincaid has a chance of being the top target on this team. We're not quite sure how that relationship is going with Stephon Diggs in Buffalo. He could be. I don't want to say it. I don't want to say that he's falling off because I don't believe that he is talent wise, but the targets spoke volumes, pun intended. So, Dave, I'm just going to finish it with this. I think you can get Dalton Kincaid for tight end 6 cost, and he can return tight end 1 value. And to me, if that's not a guy to go and buy in a top offense at a premium position, then I really don't know what is.
Yeah, and I'm looking at where these tight ends lined up last year because we've talked about it for years. Remember when Cole Beasley had back-to-back seasons with 100 plus targets from Josh
Mhm.
Allen? We kept saying wish casting another guy to step into that slot role. and we were saying maybe it's going to be Jamison Crowder, maybe it's going to be Khalil Shakir. Well, guess what? Maybe it's Dalton Kincaid, because I'm looking
Mhm.
right now, and as far as tight ends, full-time tight ends who played in line the least last year, there were only two guys that lined up in line at a fewer or at a lower rate than Dalton Kincaid last year, and it was looking right now. Hold on, Kyle Pitts and Mark Andrews. That was pretty
Yeah.
much it. If you look last year, over 60% of Dalton Kincaid snaps came in the slot. Almost 20% came out wide. I mean, he's being used pretty much as the wide receiver too here.
That's why I used the Mark Andrews
Yeah.
comp there for you. Wouldn't say he has an Isaiah Likely problem because Dalton Kincaid was being used in creative ways that wasn't your traditional tight end.
Mhm.
Now I get the worry that maybe Curtis Samuel comes in there because he's got familiarity with Joe Brady's offense and maybe he takes over the slot, but that's fine. Curtis Samuel can also move out wide. Dalton Kincaid can also move out wide. Like there's a lot of things that can be done here. I don't think you go and sign Curtis Samuel to be like, all right, Dalton Kincaid, take the back seat now, buddy. I know we spent a first round pick on you, but you just maybe you got to back off a little bit.
And
Like
let me just say
that's not
that
happening in Buffalo.
I know there's a lot of concern about Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel's best season ever came 4 years ago,
With Joe Brady.
and he had 850 receiving yards. Like he is a complimentary piece. He's fun,
Right.
he's exciting, he's versatile. He's going to be a good football addition, but I don't think that
Yeah.
he's going to really negatively impact anybody from a fantasy standpoint of value.
Yeah. I can agree with that. I can agree with that. That's why I'm saying go and buy Dalton Kincaid. Now, before we move on to our sells that we've got here, I just want to remind you guys, like if you're watching, if you're listening, if you have not gone and subscribed to the podcast, maybe this is your first time watching or listening, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you get your shows, whether it's Apple, Spotify, whatever it is, and leave us a review. It is just something we don't normally ask for these, but it's just something that is so helpful. Dave and I put in a ton of work here, whether it's behind the scenes or in front of the camera, whatever it is. And it just means so much to us. It helps us out. It makes us look decent to our boss. That way we don't get fired and lose our show. But it's one of those things we're just asking you as that favor. If you enjoy it, even just one episode, or you enjoyed one piece of information we gave you, please go ahead and leave that review for us on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Now, Dave, let's go over to ourselves here. I want you to throw out the first player that you want to sell immediately in Dynasty football.
I'm going to be boring here. I could really lump two of my cells together, and I could make them like a five
Super
player
sell.
package if I wanted to. But for me right now, I'm trying to sell Josh Jacobs. 26 years old. He's averaged 300 touches per year since coming into the league. He's got a lot of wear and tear on his body. And a lot of people see the 4-year deal with Green Bay, but the way that it was structured, they pretty much have an out where they can get rid of him after this year. But really, again, I try reading market trends here and seeing how player value is shifting. And right now, we've seen Josh Jacobs, a guy who, like I said, 26 years old with a lot of wear and tear on his body, has jumped from the RB 15 to the RB 10 immediately after signing with Green Bay. And there's just some guys that are younger on offenses that have a little bit more security that I prefer. Rashad White is going to be with Tampa for the next 2 years. Isaiah Pacheco still has 2 years left with Kansas City. James Cook is still going to be in Buffalo for the next 2 years. I'd prefer those guys outright to Josh Jacobs, who, yeah, he's good. And we know he's going to get a lot of work. And we know the Green Bay offense is good, but it's really hard to project beyond this season what he is going to look like and what his workload is going to look like and what team he's going to be on. So I'd take the safety of some of these younger guys who still have extra years on their contract ahead of Josh Jacobs. And again, for me, it just comes down to positional stuff here. And there's some wide receivers that I'd prefer with similar values right now. Like I would take Jaden Reed or Marquise Brown over Josh Jacobs, guys that we know are still going to have years of success ahead of them. We could easily see Josh Jacobs fall off this year, fall off the year after. For me, it's just when an aging running back starts to see his value get inflated like this in the offseason, that's a guy I try moving off of. If I can get a mid first or a late first for Josh Jacobs, I'm entertaining that as well. I think Josh Jacobs is still a pretty good player. We saw a little bit of a dwindle in efficiency last year, but nothing too alarming. But for me, it just comes down to the fact that his value is moving up so quickly that I think now is the time that you try to sell high on him.
So as you were saying all that, I was at first just like, you know what? I want to push back because I disagree. I don't think you have to sell Josh Jacobs. Like
No,
I
not
don't
at
think
all.
he needs to be the guy. The thing that flipped me there, what you said was if you can go and get a first round pick for him,
Mhm.
right? Like maybe there's someone saying like, I doubt there's many people saying this, but I don't want a rookie wide receiver. I don't want Roma Dunze on my team. I'll give you a mid first for
I
Josh
mean, I think
Jacobs.
Xavier Worthy.
We'll get into that in a later episode. But I'm just saying, like, I think there might be some people that are saying I can compete right now. I want a running back, and I would prefer Josh Jacobs, this guy who's a volume guy, over maybe one of these rookie wide receivers. I'm not saying that's a smart decision, but I'm saying that is possible. If that's the case, then cool. Sell Josh Jacobs. I'm I'm not with you. I'm not going down the same road as you saying that like, oh, they can get rid of Josh Jacobs after a year, or it's hard to predict it. It's hard to predict anything in fantasy football, regardless. So I don't necessarily believe that they're going to bring in Josh Jacobs, pay him this money, and look to get over this hump by adding a good rushing attack, and then be like, you know what? Let's just try it again a year from now. I think that Josh Jacobs is their guy, especially the way that they chose him over Aaron Jones. Granted, that could happen again. You might be right. I'm fine with Josh Jacobs. I'm not going to sit here and stand on a soapbox and say no. You definitely don't sell him. I'm fine with him. If you have him, I don't know you get the value you want for him. Right now, he's going as the running back 12. I would prefer him over Rashad White. I know you said that you would take White over him.
Especially in
Um,
PPR, I'm leaning White. I mean, I'm not crazy about Rashad White. He's got some deficiencies as a runner that scare me off a little bit, but I don't think
that,
they're going to add to this running back room. They
I
made
think they
almost
will.
no push in free agency, and Rashad White is just a pass catching machine.
I think they do. I think the free agency thing was more of we have to pay Baker, we have to pay Mike
Yeah,
Evans, we've got other people to pay on this team. I think they do add a running back because you can't go into this the same way you did last year and being the worst team running the football. They were ranked 32nd in rushing yards. I don't think you can do that. We're getting a little
to a
off track
certain
here,
point,
though.
yeah, they just abandoned the run and they said we're not going to run the ball. We're just going to run a little wheel route with Rashad White and throw the ball in his hands and basically use that as our run game.
Yeah, yeah. Just to get us back on track, right? Like if we are talking about Josh Jacobs, I don't see AJ Dillon as a threat to him as to like what he's doing, and I think Josh Jacobs would need to be astronomically bad, which is in his wheelhouse. Like
Mhm.
it's in his wheelhouse to be very inefficient, but I think he'd have to be really really bad. And he would almost have to be the reason that the Packers lose in a very important game like the NFC Championship, but they can't run the ball, or the Packers are doing horrible throughout the season in rushing efficiency for them to be like, you know what, let's move on from him.
Aaron
So if you're
Jones
telling
was the
me,
reason that they won a playoff game, and they
but
just
Aaron
kicked him
Jones
out the door
also
and ate 12.5 million in debt.
yeah, yeah, but Aaron Jones also missed a ton of games.
Yeah,
He missed a ton of games. He missed 6 games. He left 3 other games early or due to injury or like couldn't play the full game due to injury. He's a bit older, and if I read the story correctly, they asked him to take a pay cut. He said
yeah.
no, and then they went, "Okay, let's go sign Josh Jacobs." And hey, Aaron, thanks, man. And yeah, maybe not that simple, but um, I'm a bit more comfortable with Josh Jacobs than you are, but I can understand that if the price is right and where he's at, someone's willing to give you a mid first, like do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm with it. I'm with it. All right. Let me go to my next player here that I want to sell. And this is weird to say because this is not the archetype that you're typically looking to sell. It's a young wide receiver with an offensive minded coach, and he produced heavily in his first season. And I'm willing to trade away Jordan Addison, Dave. Right now, he is being valued pretty highly. If you mentioned a wide receiver earlier, Tank Dell, right? Jordan Addison is one spot behind Tank Dell as the wide receiver 21 on Keep Trade Cut. He's ahead of T. Higgins, ahead of Zay Flowers, ahead of Rashee Rice. I would take all of those guys over Jordan Addison immediately. Immediately. And looking at other value adjacent players, Kyle Pitts, I would take him immediately. Travis Etienne, if I'm competing and I need a running back too, immediately.
If you're telling me that you can go out and get Kyle Pitts right now for Jordan Addison, what are
Yes.
you waiting on? Why are you
Yes.
watching the show?
Right.
Go flip over your
Right.
sweeper app and make that
No, no,
offer.
stay on the show because we need the watch time. Stay here. Stay here. We need the clicks. My thing is this, right? Is you look at some of the very obvious things with Jordan Addison. One, I'm worried about the quarterback position. Sam Darnold is good enough to support one guy. He did it with DJ Moore in Carolina over an 11 game span. It wasn't really the full season. But Darnold or even a rookie, let's say it's JJ McCarthy, let's say it's Drake May, right? Best case scenario, Drake May, they trade all the way up to pick 3 or whatever, and they get Drake May. Do we really trust a rookie to go out there and support Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison? No. Now I get it. Dynasty is not a 1-year game, but memories and reactions to things in Dynasty do kind of play like that. And you're looking at a guy who could lose a ton of value. If anything, I might be the guy looking to buy Jordan Addison a year from now. What I'm saying here is this:
Or
is Jordan
mid-season
Addison,
when
yeah,
he's
or
wide receiver
mid-season.
38.
Right. And you know what? Honestly, oftentimes I hate this kind of talk because it's like, well, why are you just going to move on from a guy to then be like, I'm back in on him 6 months later?
Because there is
Sometimes,
a cycle. There is a cycle with trade
yes,
value, and as much as
absolutely.
people say we're gonna stick to our guns and we're gonna trust the process, when it's mid-season and you have a guy that you value highly and he's not performing, people trade him for cheap. It happens all the time.
It's also about what you can get in exchange, Dave. If I'm
Mhm.
looking at the value adjacent players here, Trey McBride is almost identically valued as Jordan. I would do that
Yeah.
so fast. I would break my phone pressing accept. I would smash through the screen and get cuts all over my beautiful little hands. I'm what I don't like here, right, is you go back and you look at wide receivers, right, that have been with rookie quarterbacks over, I totally lost the stat, but it's been like over the last 11 seasons or 13 seasons, we've had 7 players do that. And they had absolutely star-studded quarterbacks. Now, receiving, catching, going for 1,000 yards does not automatically make you this great fantasy football player, but it's also a good indicator of likely success. What I don't like is the fact that you're going to have all these chips stacked against Jordan Addison going forward, and he's probably going to be third in targets on the team.
Mhm.
I think it's very likely that Justin Jefferson remains ahead of him, TJ Hawkinson remains ahead of him, and the 10 touchdowns is, in my opinion, very unsustainable. We already talked about how touchdowns are not a sticky stat to keep going year after year. When Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison were both in the field together, Addison was averaging less than 12 PPR points per game. That would have put him around wide receiver 40 if you go back and look at last year's wide receivers and where they were finishing on a points per game basis. Now, I mentioned Ryan Heath, a guy who works over at Fantasy Points. He does some excellent work, some great research. He's done a lot of research as to which stats are the stickiest in predicting fantasy production the next year. One of the things that he has looked at has been first downs and first downs per route run. And Jordan Addison ranks terrible in that. Like, we're talking
Those
outside of the
those
top
big
50
play
wide receivers.
downs that buoyed his
Exactly.
fantasy production last year, yeah.
Yes. He is what we would call a big play merchant. I've even heard some people say, like, listen, there's not much difference between Jordan Addison and Jameson Williams at this point. If we're talking pedigree, offense, and what they were able to do, a lot of it was just Addison had more opportunity. So I'm not going to go as far to say that. But I will say Jordan Addison being ranked as the wide receiver 21 right now, ahead of all those guys, and having the value of a Trey McBride or a Kyle Pitts or a Zay Flowers, Rashee Rice, T. Higgins. I would have any of those guys over Jordan Addison at this point. Dave, we talk about how he's a big play, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about with him. Him being a big play merchant, 40% of his fantasy points came from 3 games.
Mhm.
2 of those were with Kirk Cousins.
Yep. And I believe they were
I
both without
don't see
Justin
how that's,
Jefferson too.
yes, and
Yeah.
I don't see how something like that becomes sustainable. Granted, players can always get better. Outliers happen. I get it. I just want to cash in my Jordan Addison chips right now.
Yeah, I mean, if I you can right now, if you look again, since we're talking keep trade cut a lot on this show, right now there's a guy quite a few spots behind Jordan Addison that I would prefer that has a lot of these same concerns about being third on the team in targets and all these sorts of things, but I believe is a better player, better pedigree, all that. If you can trade back from Jordan Addison and get Jackson Smith and Najigba and
Oof.
add again, I'm always trying to add these injury away running backs or a second round pick that I can use to move up in a draft. If you can flip your Jordan Addison for Jackson Smith and Najigba plus more, that's exactly what you should be doing right now because I think that the future is brighter for JSN and you can get him for cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, JSN, the guy who was the wide receiver 1 ahead of Addison,
Yep.
and he's in what could be
Yeah, barely.
potentially
We're
a
splitting
better
hairs
off.
here. I think he went one
Right,
pick
right.
before. Yeah.
No. I mean, I'm not talking about draft spot. I'm talking about like where he was being ranked
Oh,
amongst
right.
the
Yeah, yeah,
dynasty community, right? Like a
yeah. Mhm.
potentially better offense. Like there's a lot there. Yeah, I'm with you. I'd prefer Jackson Smith and Jigba. Okay, let's go to our next guy. We each have one more player that we're willing to sell here in Dynasty. And Dave, this next one that you have, I could not agree more. I'm so done with it. Just the floor is yours, my man. Let me back out everybody. You're gonna ISO. Take this to the hoop.
Yeah, DeAndre Swift, another guy who we are seeing rise in value right now, and man, I can't help but think that people are just holding on to their priors here. That draft class was loaded with DeAndre Swift and Jonathan Taylor and Clyde Edwards-Helaire and J.K. Dobbins. A lot of those guys haven't panned out. Now that we're listening to them out loud, but at the time we talked about what a great draft class this was, and a lot of people had DeAndre Swift as their RB1. And now here we are with 4 years of production, or should I say lack of production in front of us. And people are still year after year trying to make DeAndre Swift into something. And he's good at some things. When he gets out in space, he's really elusive and he's tough to tackle and he's good at catching the ball and he's good at doing these things. But we finally saw it last year where he had a career year. He barely eclipsed 1,000 rushing yards and he had 12.5 PPR points per game. I mean, that's like the best case scenario where he was the running back one, hardly splitting touches with anybody, playing behind arguably the league's best offensive line. And now he goes to Chicago, and we don't know exactly what the usage split is going to look like here. I have talked quite a bit about how Shane Waldron likes to lean on one running back as opposed to Luke Getsy, who likes to kind of have this committee of running backs. But at the end of the day, Roshan Johnson is still there, and he was picked by this head coach and by this GM. Khalil Herbert, no slouch whatsoever, is still there.
Herbert.
So Khalil Herbert, if we're just splitting hairs here and looking at who the best running back is, Khalil Herbert is the best rusher of the group. And there is a world where Khalil Herbert is just the early down guy and he gets the majority of the goal line work. And DeAndre Swift and Roshan Johnson both excel in passing downs. Now, obviously, we could talk about the money, and that's not something that I buy into too much because following the money is what got us to draft Kenny Galladay and Jonnu Smith and a lot of bad players over the years. They are paying DeAndre Swift, and people are going to see that contract and say, well, he's going to be a featured back. But at the end of the day, there's two talented young running backs that are on the roster behind him. We're talking about a guy who we've seen lose his role to David Montgomery, or not David Montgomery, Jamal Williams. I mean, for whatever reason, talked about this a couple of weeks ago on the show, he has made basically every coaching staff sour on him at some point, whether it's his lack of willingness to run into contact or pick up the extra yards, whether it's that he's a little bit too east-west for coaches' likings. Whatever it is, DeAndre Swift has never been a featured back. I don't expect him randomly in year 5 to become a featured back. And when you look at the guys that he's getting drafted, he's only a few spots right now behind Josh Jacobs, who I just talked about. People are looking at him as a high-end RB2, and the fact of the matter is he's never been a high-end RB2 in fantasy. I don't know why we're expecting that to suddenly happen in his year 25 season.
Did you say his year 25
Age,
season?
age 25
Oh,
season.
age. It feels
Year
like
5.
25 years
Age
though.
25.
Feels like 25 years. Yeah, I'm with you, man. I'm with you. I think that DeAndre Swift is the perfect example of a player to sell on right now. Simply because Caleb Williams also not a check down guy. Like we're probably not going to see a bajillion design pass plays for DeAndre Swift either, where he gets his value with the addition of Keenan Allen, with DJ Moore, who's obviously going to command targets. What you're expecting and hoping is that he can, maintain the same rushing production that he did on one of the best rushing teams in the league. I don't know that I see it. And I think a lot of people agree with it because I'm looking over at Keep Trade Cut, and you know how they do that, like, who would you keep? Who would you trade? Who would you cut? DeAndre Swift, out of 6 options here, 5 times users have decided to trade him away. And I think people are seeing it. The value is
Mhm.
way too high for him right now. And the consensus agrees with you, Dave. Look at that.
How about
Big,
it?
big W.
And
Big
honestly, I'll
W.
just say, like, this is the time of year where, like, any running back that is moving up, any running back that's over age 25, moving up in rankings is a guy that I'm just trying to move away from, unless they're like dirt cheap. I'm talking like Gus Edwards cheap. That's the kind of guy I might throw a dart on because I can buy him for a late third. But there's just so many guys here that I'd be trying to sell. And I already talked about Josh Jacobs. I talked about DeAndre Swift, but I'll lump Saquon Barkley in there. I'll lump Travis Etienne in there. Um, you know,
That's enough out of you.
David Montgomery. It's just a lot of these
Okay.
guys that
Yeah,
are
you're
valued
back in.
inside the top 15, inside the top 18. Those are the guys I'm trying to move off of at this point in the season, off
That's
season.
fair. You also just hate running backs in general. So that's That's
I do.
understandable.
I mean, why pay up? Why spend a first round pick on DeAndre Swift when you could just wait for somebody to get injured and stumble into this year? I mean, people literally, and by people I mean me, won dynasty
I'm
leagues
people.
last year starting Ty Chandler and Zamir White. And I don't know who those guys are going to be this year, but I'm going to have 8 to 10 injury away running backs stashed on my roster. And when that opportunity arises, you're going to get similar or equal production than you would have on the guys you spent a first round pick on.
I I think the low hanging fruit argument against that is that you don't get a full season of production. You likely don't get long standing production.
Doesn't matter.
And yeah, I
Running
mean,
back
maybe
is a
to you.
weekly game. Wide receivers are the guys that you plug in for an entire season. Running back, look at how volatile, like we do weekly rankings. You know how it is, like how volatile these weekly rankings are, where a guy who is running back 85 one week is all of a sudden a top 12 guy because the guy ahead of him got injured. That never happens with wide receivers. It doesn't happen with quarterbacks. Running backs are the only position that are that volatile on a week to week basis. So when I'm playing Dynasty, I'm not trying to pick up a running back and say, this is going to be my RB1 for the next 17 weeks. I'm trying to say, who can get me 20 points on any given week? That's all I care about. And if I get 1 week of production, great. If I get 12 weeks of production, awesome. But I don't expect anybody to be a plug and play running back for the entire season.
That's such a nihilistic view, Dave. I'm not even going to comment on it. Let's just move on. I'm going to give you my final guy here to sell. And this is probably going to ruffle some feathers. So strap in, folks. Get your seatbelts on. Because I'm talking about Will Levis, quarterback for the Tennessee Titans, who right now is being valued as the quarterback 23 on Keep Trade Cut. Let me just double check this right now because it may have changed within the last hour. But these values keep changing constantly. So Will Levis, yep, still quarterback 23. The Titans are building around him, and I get it, big time. Their version of big time, whatever that is. Tony Pollard, Calvin Ridley. Um, it almost seems more like an island of misfit toys, and they're like, all right, Will Levis, have fun. But now the recent trade for L'Jarius Sneed, which is weird to say that a trade for a corner makes me feel different about the offense because it makes me feel like the Titans are really trying to go in on this team and be good as soon as they can. And their GM, Rand Carthon, I don't know after making all these moves, spending this money, sending these trades out, investing in veterans, not young guys, but investing in veterans in almost what seems to be like a weird win now window. I don't think that he can sit around and let Will Levis develop over a couple of years. It's going to be one of those things where we're going to find out really quickly if Will Levis is good at football or not. I tend to lean more towards not being good at football. And we saw a ceiling for Will Levis, a 4 touchdown game. We also saw a lot of bad stuff. And we're hearing a lot of the words that there are no excuses for Will Levis this year. And this is a weird Titans team that looks like they are spending to try to compete for their division against the Texans, which I don't see happening. But I'm going to stick with this that the leash is going to be short for Will Levis. And I just don't want to get stuck holding onto the bag here at quarterback, a position that, Dave, you talk about all the time is incredibly valuable in Superflex. And you can get such good return on a trade, especially for a young guy that we don't know much about. And I know we talked about finding value in uncertainty when I mentioned T. Higgins. And the same thing can be true in the inverse, right? Where if you have a guy that there's not a lot of consensus on, there's going to be someone that thinks that he can be the next great quarterback. He can be the next Josh Allen, which was all the talk that was coming out about him when he was chugging mayonnaise before the NFL draft. My thing is I look at Will Levis and there are just, you know what? I'll get back to me. I'll get back to me, Dave. I want to hear what you have to say because I see it on your face. I see that, I know you've had some thoughts about Will Levis, and I know that your approach is going to be like shoot for the stars, especially if it's a quarterback. And let's see what we can get. So I want to hear what you have to say about this.
I don't hate Will Levis. I think that he showed enough promise that they're doing the right thing by building around him. But I do really like the point you make about them not really having time to develop him. With all of these win now moves that they made, they need to see it almost immediately for them to kind of justify continuing to trot him out. And if he is just terrible to start the season, you might see him make a move for a veteran to try to bring somebody in here. So that's a point that I hadn't really thought about. And I always like when you challenge my thought process a little bit. But
Mhm.
looking right now where Will Levis is, again, since we're talking so much about keep trade cut here today,
Yeah.
there's really only one guy that's like ranked behind him that I would really want, and that's Deshaun Watson. And Deshaun Watson could have easily been a guy that I could have talked about as a buy on this episode. He was a top 14 quarterback in 4 or 5 starts last year. I think people have just really, really pushed him too far down the ranks. But outside of that, I think he's kind of appropriately valued. Baker Mayfield ahead of him, Kirk Cousins, Bryce Young, JJ McCarthy, Jared Goff. I think all those guys deserve to be ahead of him. But the ceiling outcome for Will Levis makes him kind of enticing at that point where he's at right now. That being said, I probably wouldn't be comfortable giving up anything than like a very, very late first, like 110, 111, 112. He's not somebody that I'm aggressively going out and trying to buy. I'm not trying to sell him either. I think right now he's just kind of where he should be, and you hold him and you see what happens.
And I'm not going to push back on that. In terms of the value, I don't think his value is overinflated. He is kind of where he should be because of the uncertainty. What I contest is that I think that value is going to drop, and it's going to drop fast when he can't perform the way that some people are hoping. There are Desmond
So you're just
Ritter-ish
a glass
vibes
half empty type of guy.
when it comes to Will Levis.
What
Yes.
if the
No.
glass is half full, and what if he comes out and all of a sudden he's got these weapons and he starts balling out, and
No.
then we're looking at him as an immediate, like, if he does that, let's just say in this world of hypotheticals, Will Levis comes out, throws for 600 yards and 7 touchdowns over the first 2 weeks. He is immediately a top 10 dynasty quarterback.
Sure.
Everybody is going to want
The
Will
same can
Levis.
be said about anybody, though.
Right.
The same can be said
Yeah.
about any of these guys. Like Deshaun Watson goes up, Michael Penix goes up, like
Right.
JJ McCarthy, like all these young guys go up. But he's right next to Baker Mayfield, who Baker
Mhm.
Mayfield, at least I know there's a future there, and there's also other good players
Baker
on that
Mayfield is a
campaign.
buy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I'm buying
And so if we're looking
Mayfield.
at players that are adjacent to each other in value, like I'd rather go there. The thing for me is like I look at Will Levis, and whether it's been on film, whether it's been analytics, whatever like there are these like Desmond Ritter-ish vibes where you say, "Ooh, he's surrounded by weapons." Just kind of like how Desmond Ritter was last year. And
Mhm.
ooh, if everything breaks the right way, he could be really good. I'm gonna get him now while it's still, the juice is worth the squeeze. You got an offensive minded head coach, but then you've also got a quarterback who, in his time last year, high turnover worthy throw rate, high pressure to sack rate, all the same things that were problems for him in college were problems for him in the pros. So now we're asking that with a brand new coach, a brand new offense, brand new weapons on his team, he's got to fix those problems and adjust to all these new things. It's a lot of faith that people are having in a guy who had 1 or 0 touchdowns in 6 of his 8 starts. And I'm just not there with him. I understand that there are outliers. I understand that Will Levis can develop under Brian Callahan. History is not on his side. And Dave, I want to list you some of these guys that make me say history is not on his side. Are you ready?
Let's hear it.
There have been 21 quarterbacks drafted in the second round over the last 21 years, including Levis. Only 5 of those 21 quarterbacks have ever been top 12 fantasy quarterbacks. It's kind of an arbitrary place to put it, but let's just go at top 12. Jalen Hurts was 3. So he did that 3 times. Jalen Hurts is also a freak of nature. Colin Kaepernick did it once in 2013. Never did it again throughout his career, by the way. And that's with other years where he was productive as a starter. Derek Carr has one of those years in 2016. Geno Smith with the ever elusive 9-year breakout. And then Andy Dalton did it twice in his early career with AJ Green.
Ooh, I forget
So
that Andy Dalton was a round 2 guy.
so it's possible. But when I start to list you, Kyle Trask, Drew Lock, who reminds me so much of Will Levis, Deshaun
Yeah,
Kaiser, Christian
yeah.
Hackenberg, Jimmy Garoppolo, who was never a top 12 quarterback, Brock Osweiler, Brian Brom, Pat White, Jimmy Clausen, Kellen Clemens,
Oh,
Chad
Pat
Henne,
White,
Kevin
what could have
Cobb, John
been.
Beck, Drew Stanton, Tavares Jackson. Like we're going back, 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 back. It's an arbitrary thing to say second round quarterbacks just don't produce, but it's
But
usually
yeah,
something you
draft
see that
capital
if
matters, especially for quarterbacks. Yeah.
yes, and especially if a team believes in them and wants to give them a longer leash, they're likely drafting them in the first round.
Mhm.
So I struggle with valuing Will Levis as a top 24 dynasty quarterback going forward. I don't think that arrow is going to keep pointing up. I think it's only going to point down. And I asked some people on Twitter what they'd be willing to trade, and I put this scenario out there: Will Levis and the rookie 108. It's probably, let's call it maybe Brock Bowers or something, or you're just out. No, you're just outside of that Brock Bowers in Superflex, right?
I
You'd
voted on
be
this
at,
poll, and I'll tell you where I went after you.
yeah,
Read it off.
you're at the, let's say maybe it's Will Levis and Brock Bowers, or Will Levis and JJ McCarthy. I'd much rather have Brock Purdy over that. I'd rather have Tua Tagovailoa over that. I'd rather have Dak Prescott. I'd rather have quarterbacks that can
Well,
be
see, I
top
saw the
12
Justin
quarterbacks in
Herbert one, and
Dynasty.
I thought that was I was like,
Oh,
"Who Justin Herbert in a
the
heartbeat." I don't
fact that
know. Yeah.
I left it out because not enough people even voted towards the
Yeah.
side of like Levis and the pick. But the fact that there was even like 17% that was like, ooh, yeah, get rid of Herbert. I was like, you're insane people.
See,
Also,
I think I'd
roughly
take
30.
I think I'd take Levis in a late first over Tua right now.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I mean, listen, that was the most 50-50 split vote
Yeah.
of all of them. So like I get that. I wouldn't. That's not my fandom coming out. That is, we've seen the ceiling for Tua. We've seen how good the offense can be, and I think it can remain there for at least 2 more years, right? And then the value is still going to be there if I ever want to sell him again in the future. Also, the one that stood out to me, scientific research here, that approximately 30% of people are willing to trade Trevor Lawrence for Will Levis in the 108. I would take Trevor Lawrence in that scenario all day long.
Oh yeah.
So the fact that nearly 1 in 3 people are willing to do that trade, go and see if someone in your league wants to do that. Purdy, Lawrence, Tua, Dak, I'd take all those guys over Will Levis in a late first. And it seems like these are moves that people are willing to make, Dave. All right. We talked about our buys. We talked about ourselves.
Almost a full
Once again,
hour on 4 players. We got off on some tangents today.
no, it's eight players. It's 8 players.
Oh
Do your
yeah,
math,
4
Dave.
each. Yeah,
You're
yeah.
the numbers guy. How did you mess? You're getting so old. It's so adorable to see his mind go, people. Dave is only 2 months older than me, and his mind is slipping. We're going to be back next week. We're going to be talking about the rookie class. We are basically a month away, Dave, from the NFL draft. We're going to have Danny Kelly from The Ringer joining us next week to talk about rookies, just some of like the coolest superlatives, like players most likely to be fill in the blank. And Danny Kelly and that show over at The Ringer, they do a great job. He's been a longtime NFL draft analyst. Super excited to have him. So make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, you're subscribed to the audio podcast, and you're catching next week's episode. As always, I want to thank you guys for tuning in, for watching, for listening. And as always, big thanks to our production team behind the scenes. Big thank you to Dave Kluge. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time. Adios.